Hi everyone. My talk today will quickly give an intro to myself and our studio, and then I'll look at the approach that we took with our game Stories of Blossom and share the lessons that we learned along the way. By the end, I'll hopefully have sparked some inspiration in each of you to take what I shared today with you back into your own work. My name's Conor Bradley, founder and creative director of Softleaf Studios. We are a small indie team striving to make accessible game experiences that can be enjoyed by everyone. To do this, we work closely with people from the disabled and neurodiverse communities to help us remove the barriers from our games so that they can be played. Currently, we're wrapping up the development of an accessible point-and-click adventure called Stories of Blossom, and we really cannot wait to get that out there. Before I get into the main nitty-gritty of this talk, I thought I'd share a little bit about my own story and why I founded Softleaf Studios. Growing up, I struggled a lot with depression, and games were there as my form of relief. But this idea that not everyone had the same access to games, in my mind, was just not fair. Everyone should have this right. So knowing very little about how to run a business and at the time accessibility as well, I went and formed the studio with this goal of trying to make games that were by design accessible. And many lessons have been learned and mistakes made along the way, which I hope to share with you today. This is Abby, by the way, I'm sitting here with, and she's a grey staffy. We recently just added her to the family. Meet her. So we started with the goal of producing a point and click adventure that had as few barriers as possible. So everything we did, from the game's narrative, the puzzles, the menus, and how we marketed the game to our audience, we reviewed it all with the question, what kind of barrier could be presented to our players and how can we minimize that? In my mind, for the most part, accessibility is seen as this separate entity in game development. I often hear from developers, oh, we don't have the budget or the time left to start making our game accessible. And I often think, well, why is that? I believe most developers treat accessibility as an additional feature that they have to design and implement. But for me, this is not the case. Accessibility should not be treated as an add-on. We as developers want everyone to play our games and enjoy them. So why do most of us ignore this task of making games accessible to everyone? So rather than seeing it as a box to tick, I suggest looking at it as a way of opening up your game experience to more players in your community, because everyone benefits from accessibility. And when a game is not by design made accessible, Your players can experience confusion, frustration, and in some cases can be hurt by the experience, which leads to negative reviews, refunding of your game, and on a more human level, we just don't want this for our players. So rather than see accessibility as this separate thing, we applied it to all aspects of our game's development and marketing. We feel that everyone on the team should be asking themselves, does what I've just created present unintentional barriers to our players or audience? And if so, what can I do to minimize those? In my mind, this is the way that we all should be working from the very beginning, all the way until the end of a game's life cycle. Now, I have the privilege of being my own boss and being able to have this strong focus and direct the work that we do in this direction. And I'm aware that not everyone may feel like they have the same leisure to do so. But I would argue that you don't need to be your own boss to make things accessible. There's a lot that we can do in your own work, even if accessibility is not the main goal of your company. For example, if you're a community manager, you could start adding alt text to all visual posts. Or if you're an artist, you can make more informed decisions on the colors you choose and when setting contrast for your scenes. And these kind of actions will not go unnoticed by your players. These small changes can have a large impact. And soon the rest of your team will want to be doing their part to make what they do accessible. It really does spread like wildfire. But at this point, I think it is important to state there is only so much you as an individual or you as your team can do by yourselves. So I recommend as early as possible, have your game tested by a diverse group of individuals, including the disabled and neurodiverse communities that are often forgot about when it comes to testing. I would say that even if some of your team are part of these communities, I feel it's best to get the game in front of as many people as you can and have them play it and getting that feedback. During our game's prototype, we invited players to test our game's accessibility. And when I say early, we didn't have animations. The game was full of bugs and majority of the audio assets had yet to be created. While for some, this lack of content added to confusion, it was so important that we had started this testing process this early before we had spent the time and money building out the game. We had got this great feedback on the direction that we needed to take it. And at this stage, we were able to afford to make these changes. If we had waited until the very end of production or after the game's release, it would have been a lot more destructive to start making these changes. And I feel this is why a lot of developers are still not touching accessibility. In their minds, it's too risky and expensive to start looking at accessibility at these later stages. But I think it's important to remember that no developer is intentionally excluding people from playing their games. Really comes down to not being aware in the first place, not knowing the steps that they need to take to start removing those barriers. And sometimes it's just not having that right mindset. But as we have shown, and many other studios and individuals, the earlier you start this process, the better the outcome will be. But of course, like everyone, we are on our own little journey when it comes to accessibility and how we make inclusive experiences. Stories of Blossom started as this idea, and then from there grew as we as a team grew. It blossomed, if you will. And the reason we were able to do that was because there is so many great resources and people out there that are more than happy to get you started. And it's important to remember that what you do will not be perfect, especially if it's your first time doing it, like it was for us. But it's having that strength to admit that, okay, yes, we did that wrong this time, but take that knowledge forward and have that growth mindset and improve your work in the future. But don't forget to highlight and celebrate what you have achieved. This approach really helped us iterate the game throughout to what it is today. To give some examples of how we started, we ensured that every line of dialogue was clear and concise by testing each of their readability. But at the same time, we wanted to include as much information about the visuals in there so that for players who had low vision or are blind, for example, we're not missing out on that same context. So this is where we got to with this example before our first test session. And once we had received all this great feedback on what we were doing correctly, what we could be doing a lot better, we came to the realization that there was so many of these players who could not see the visuals, were missing so much of the game's content. From things like character descriptions, environment, set pieces, to even the overall aesthetic of the game. Without this information, the player was missing out on the overall charm of Claire's storybook illustrations and her character designs. And in some cases, the puzzle hints that we had put in carefully, we've taken time to put those in as hints, but they were missing out on all of that. So at this point, we decided to write and record audio descriptions for our game. At the time, we hadn't came across any other examples to help us with this in games. So we had looked at other forms of media, such as TV and film, for the best approach to it. And it's great to hear now other games doing audio descriptions, and I feel like this is an area that we can see growing in the next couple of years. It's very exciting to be a part of that. And the response that we got from this implementation alone was staggering. It was around this time that we truly seen the impact that our decisions can be having on our players. It really has been a huge accomplishment for us, and we are really proud of that. But again, what we did was we were looking for barriers that were there for our players, and we tried our best to remove them. For us, we have the luxury of being a heavy narrative game, so we were able to pause the game and cue audio descriptions when they were needed. So if there was two characters speaking with each other, we were able to just treat it as another dialogue line, put in the audio descriptions. And we tried to space it out as much as possible so the player wasn't getting overwhelmed with information at the same time. And the response to that was phenomenal, and I feel like as we move as an industry more in this direction with audio descriptions, they'll only get better and better. One thing with this project, we've always been striving for greatness on accessibility, and I would be lying if we didn't say we were running into some barriers ourselves, especially when it came to the game being tested. The feedback that you receive can be difficult to hear, especially if it's been worded in a heated manner, which for accessibility it usually is because there is some big blocking point with the game. But this is what we as developers need to hear. This kind of feedback, if we action it, can greatly improve the accessibility for our players. And I don't know about you, but I would rather hear about it while we're developing the game rather than later on in a negative review that other potential customers are reading. And through this process, we also discovered for ourselves that one fix for one player could be a major problem for another. And that's why it's so important to be testing this throughout. A big thing in point and click games is having to point and click. The clue is in the genre's title. But this is one thing that we tried to address early on, is that not everyone can use a mouse or an analog stick to point a cursor on a screen. And for some that can not physically see the cursor in the first place, this can be a big barrier. So what we did to solve this, for those interested, was that on top of offering this typical pointing and clicking, we offered the player the option to tab through the different hotspots in each scene, similar to a way that you would tab on a web browser on all the different interactable elements. We find this worked really well with text-to-speech as well. So it was very much like a menu. They can toggle between each element in the scene and it'll read back what they had currently highlighted. Again, giving the player more context that they would have otherwise been missing. A big benefit to this was it lowered the number of controls needed to play the game. Currently, a player only needs 2 digital buttons to interact with our entire game. No analog movement required. And I feel like this is kind of a reminder to the developers out there that just because a controller and a keyboard has so many buttons and keys to press, it doesn't mean that you have to use every single one of them. Majority of the time you can get away with using the same input to perform multiple actions. As long as they're not being used at the same time, you can usually get away with it. And like any large task, it's best to break it down into manageable tasks and work on what will have the most impact. When we first started this process, we were taking on far too much for a small team, and we soon became swamped with everything that needed to be implemented before our first test session. So rather than try to fix everything in a handful of weeks, try to prioritize the removal of your barriers and narrow down your test group so that the players that are impacted by what you're trying to fix, it's more focused in that area. When it came to prioritizing these adjustments, we try to prioritize what we seen as being more severe. For example, a blind player not being able to navigate menus or gameplay was more severe than, say, the character limit in subtitles. While these were features that we definitely wanted to have in the game, at this early stage, there's only so much you can achieve. So that's the approach we took, and we feel like it worked well. We were working on what will have the biggest impact for our players, and we were able to then test it. This not only gave us time to implement those changes, but it also avoided players running into barriers that we had yet to have time to remove. And of course, making games accessible it does take efforts to do. For example, any new screen or section of gameplay in our case also meant implementing new text-to-speech cues, making sure the focus order was correct, ensuring that nothing was broken with all the new options. And this required a lot of testing to make sure that we were happy with it. So I recommend what we did was try to have robust systems in place and make use of automated testing for things like the focus orders. It's made that a lot easier to handle, so you're not having to manually adjust these things every time you implement something new. Game development can be a hard job at times, and it can be difficult to stay motivated working on the same project month by month by month without having some form of strong motivator. And we really find that accessibility and seeing our players really enjoy their time with our game has been such a big boost for us and what we're doing. And I think without it, this would have been a lot harder for us to do. But also seeing the great work that other studios and individuals are doing has been such a huge influence on our work and what we've been doing. And we're really happy to see that the future of games is starting to look more accessible. And that's why it is so important to share your own stories. So other developers can look at those, because everyone is different, but also sharing your different solutions to different barriers that you had in your game can really help those who maybe don't know the best way to tackle a problem. It serves as an inspiration that they can apply it to their own games. But even just to experience the joy that you receive from players that can now play your game without running into barriers, it really is infectious. Receiving comments, hearing that your game has made their day better. And this is how games should be. Players should not have to do research in advance to see if it was designed for them in mind. It should just be an expected thing that we as developers do. But again, until we get to that point, share all your great work with your audiences. Let them know what to expect on release rather than keep them in the dark. And I truly believe that the more that we do this, the more that the industry will grow in that direction. And it's really exciting to be a part of that. I'm sure you all would agree. But yes, keep up the great work and always buzzed when a new game is coming out or has just announced a new accessibility option. It keeps us motivated, as I said. So to have a quick recap on all of that, accessibility isn't an add-on. Try to integrate it into everything you do. You don't need to be the head of your department or the director of a company to do something about it. It's just changing your mindset to making your work more accessible by removing those barriers. And that will help build your company to be more accessible. But remember to collaborate with the disabled and neurodiverse communities, because at the end of the day, we are designing our game experiences and removing these barriers with them in mind, and without their day-to-day knowledge and experience, we are really just guessing. But it also helps identify areas that you as a developer may not have thought about. I know for Stories of Blossom, we would be nowhere near where we are today without them. So a big thank you to everyone. And continue to share your insights on how we as an industry can be growing and as individuals. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done, but this conference and everyone who's been involved in it, it is so inspirational to always be hearing that there's something being done. Try to share that with everyone else and we'll get there. Thank you for watching.